Hello and welcome. My name is Erik Reischl, and in this tutorial I will perform and explain the piano sonata in C major, opus 53 by Beethoven, the so-called Waldstein Sonata. Before we start, let me give you a brief introduction to the life and work of Beethoven, as well as on the formal structure of a classical sonata. If you already have knowledge on those aspects, you may skip this part and go directly to video number 2, where I explain the Waldstein Sonata step by step. Beethoven was born in December 1770 in Bonn and died at the age of 57 in Vienna. He spent his early years in Bonn, where he got the majority of his musical education and also composed his first music. The year 1792 marked a new era in his life. Having met Mozart 5 years before, who was very fond of him, he moved to Vienna with the help of numerous patrons, among which we also find Graf Ferdinand Ernst von Waldstein, to whom this sonata is dedicated. In Vienna, Beethoven studied with Haydn and other important composers. 3 years later, the first compositions were officially published, but of course there already existed various works of the Bonn and early Vienna period before, just without opus numbers. His hearing problems began in fact quite early, being only 28 years old. However, these problems did not become serious until the year 1801, and they led to complete deafness in approximately 1819. His personality was described by contemporary witnesses as grumpy, misanthropic, having high ethical values, and being adamant. Here you will see some of the major and/or most known works by Beethoven. As you can see, Beethoven wrote the Waldstein Sonata being 33 years old, thus it is considered to be a masterpiece of the so-called middle period. Works like the Pathétique and the First Symphony fall into the early period, and the so-called late period starts around 1815. If you keep in mind that composers like Schumann, Chopin or Liszt were already young adults when Beethoven died, you will understand why Beethoven's works start in the musical era of First Viennese School, but late works can be considered as early romantic pieces. Now let's have a brief look on the layout of a sonata. A sonata can have 3 or 4 movements. The first movement is usually fast, like allegro, the second slow, like adagio or andante. And the last movement can be a finale or rondo and is either very fast, presto, or moderately fast, allegretto. In case of a sonata with 4 movements, between the slow and the final movement there is a menuetto or, as preferred by Beethoven, a scherzo. It is interesting to compare this layout with the Waldstein Sonata. Although you could consider the adagio molto a slow second movement, it is in fact just an introduction to the following rondo. So what happened with the slow movement? I will tell you about this a little later. Before we start to analyze the Waldstein Sonata, allow me a very short explanation of the formal structure of the first movement, the so-called sonata form or sonata allegro form. The first movement is divided into 4 parts. The exposition introduces all the main themes. In the development section, these themes are put together in a great conflict with a variety of harmonical changes. The recapitulation is similar to the exposition with some minor yet important differences. Mostly the movement ends with the so-called coda. If we now take a closer look into the exposition, as well as the recapitulation, we find that this section is itself divided into 3 parts. The first subject is usually strong and rhythmical. The second provides an important contrast, being lyrical and soft. The third group, the codetta, brings the energy back and the exposition to its end. The major difference between exposition and recapitulation is that the second group of the exposition is also in a contrasting key, for instance G major when the sonata is in C major, whereas the second group of the recapitulation has the same key as the whole work. That would be C major in our case. This is the end of part 1. I hope you enjoyed it. In part 2, I will explain the exposition of the first movement of Beethoven's Waldstein Sonata. So stay tuned, see you next time.